If you're having trouble getting the good ending of Johanka's Madonna of Sasau DLC quest, this video will guide you through the actions I did, which resulted in Johanka's life not only being spared, it was also done in a manner where the defendant's side won decisively. To expedite this topic, I'm approaching this with the assumption that you've already played it, and before we begin, there are several requirements we need to prepare. The most important of which is high charisma and speech, around 15 or higher if possible, because there are certain dialogue checks that must be passed. In this case, skills that enhance them such as Herbalism's flower power, Drinking's loose tongue, and Maintenance's fragrance, as well as Savile Row should be utilized. It's also a good idea to carry several Amour and Bard potions, just in case critical dialogue checks fail. In one instance, level 3 first aid perk will be brought up during a conversation, and True Slav drinking skill paired with pickpocketing will also come in handy. Finally, having a set of gear that's good enough for us to take on a group of enemies is absolutely necessary. If you have all of these things checked out, we're now ready to begin. When Johanka sends us to Skalitz to check out the meaning behind her first dream, we'll realize that there is something to what she's experiencing, but the interpretation is off. With the benefit of hindsight, the game suggests that her dreams of a divine nature is most likely real, to a point that even the Inquisitor himself believe it.
If the Virgin Mary should happen to visit you again, tell Father Fabian he will send for me. All right?
But her egregious error of trying to understand them and take action on her own instead of confiding with the church is what got her into trouble. This informs us of how Henry should approach her situation at all times. We want to be a supportive friend, but there should always be room for doubt. So every time we are given a choice during conversations to either be supportive or contrarian, we choose the former, unless there's another option that expresses uncertainty. For example, after she talked about her recurring first dream, we have the option to either agree that it's no ordinary vision or dismiss it. So the better option here is the former.
You're right. That's no ordinary dream you're talking about.
Exactly. I'm glad you don't think I'm mad.
In another, when we report back to her about what we saw in Skalitz, we have a choice to describe it in a way that matches her description exactly, or to say that there are clear differences. In this one, the latter option is preferable. The impact of these choices beyond reputation gain or loss is uncertain, but in order to maximize the chances of absolving herself in the end, I think this is what needs to be done. With that out of the way, we can now discuss those events which have a clear effect. After Johanka's speech at the town square, she will be approached by the Sasau tailor's wife named Guta and asks for help about her husband's gambling habits. Upon discussing the matter, we choose to win the shirt off his back and divulge his plan to the requester afterwards. One important note here is that I promised to return the tailor's groschen in full, in order to secure her testimony during the trial without any issues. Since the outcome of this whole mess partly hinges on the amount of vocal support she gets, in conjunction with Henry's reputation as her representative, I refrain from doing anything dubious with the matters of people they help along the way. As for Ambrose, the Sasau tailor, getting him to quit playing dice is quite easy, if our drinking skill is at least level 7, with the True Slav skill activated. During their session, all we have to do is choose the response option with 2 drinks on all conversation topics. When the list is exhausted, an additional one where Henry asks an existential question will pop up, and we have 2 choices. If you prefer to engage Ambrose in a series of dice games, down 2 drinks. I, however, cannot recommend this because getting him to lose all of his money through gambling is a slow process, and depending on how drunk Henry is, the camera will rotate around uncontrollably, which is not good if you're prone to motion sickness. Instead, I suggest getting it over quickly by consuming 3 drinks to put him to sleep, so we can steal his money afterwards. The next morning, we confront him about it, and here are my dialogue choices. That includes returning all of his money back. Throwing his dice down a well is optional and does not affect the outcome, so we'll just keep it for ourselves. Before returning to Johanka, we can go back to Guta first to tell her how it went and gain reputation along the way.
Yeah, I gave it back to him so he can buy what he needs.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Henry.
The next person of interest is Adela, a Ledechko bathhouse maid who we met during Henry's investigations, our answer to Johanka when asked about it. Once we get there, the madam of the establishment will give us the key to their room if we tell her that the church sent us. Upon entering, it doesn't matter if we beat up Henslin or get him to leave, because we'll have to fight him along with his 2 thugs on our way back. They're all heavily armed, so we have to make sure our combat gear is equipped prior to our return trip. But before that encounter, we have to recruit Adela first, and here are my dialogue choices. Their conversation is a bit lengthy that mostly revolved around convincing her to give up their current job in exchange for service at the monastery. This is where level 3 first aid perk will come in handy, because Henry's response related to it gave the most compelling reason for her to seek a new life. Once we make it back, Adela will offer herself to Henry, which we should refuse. Otherwise, it will be brought up during her testimony and affect Henry's reputation. After reporting back to Johanka, she'll tell us about a group of troublemakers by the monastery entrance. Before we deal with them, now is the right time to ask her about Sebastian von Berg, through this topic related to why she's not sleeping in the stables anymore. This nobleman is a horrible character whose actions are driven by personal desire, and I highly suggest staying away from him, even later on when we're given the option to talk to him before the trial, because his suggestion for Johanka to run away and make her his estate mistress is a terrible idea. So we'll deal with the troublemakers ourselves instead of relying on him. Their leader is named Loudmouth, and even though his name suggests rowdiness, he's actually polite in conversation, so I decided to send them all away without resorting to violence. More importantly, by bribing him, we find out that someone sent them to cause trouble for Johanka and her followers. This is a vital piece of info that we later find out who. After resolving that matter, our next objective is to help Pavel of Kalin retrieve a stash of groschen. The important thing here is that the money must be donated to Johanka's infirmary, because it's the only option where he will stay in Sasau until her trial and be available as a supporter. It's best to bring up the donation recipient question after we retrieve his belongings, so we can make the necessary preparations, such as chugging down on a bard potion, because the speech check for it is quite high. Just like before, we want to maintain Henry's good reputation, so I donated all of Pavel's money in his name. Before we move on to the next segment, we should ask Johanka first about the gifts people leave by her door through this topic. The relevant tidbit which Henry should be made aware of is that she does not bless anyone or anything. It may seem like an insignificant detail, but the bishop will ask him about it during the trial. After Johanka's second speech and the fist fight that followed, she will ask Henry a series of questions about his sins. The best responses here is to be honest, regardless of how it affects his reputation. As far as I can tell, our answers will determine the donation amount we should give to the Ujits Church after undergoing a pilgrimage of penance. Thankfully, we don't have to follow her guidelines closely. Wearing the penitent's robe is entirely optional, and we can certainly ride our horse as we travel along the designated path without any repercussion. The one thing we must not forget is to talk about Johanka after we hand over our donation to Father Godwin. It's vital that we tell him what happened in detail, because it will remind him of a book by Matthew of Sasau that discusses other women who had similar experience. After he hands over the manuscript, we give it a quick read, and that should be enough. Once we get back to the monastery and upon learning of Johanka's imprisonment, it's now time to have a talk with the bishop. My overall approach in talking to him was to remain composed at all times, asking only essential questions and answering his in a truthful manner. There is another hefty speech check here when we ask him to let us defend her, but even if it fails, the bishop would allow it after a sizable donation. Before their conversation ends, he will ask for details surrounding Johanka, and I think it's best if we divulge everything we know, even the bad ones, to maintain full transparency and to avoid any nasty surprises during the trial. In addition, he will also ask Henry to report any suspicious activity around the church, so I did exactly just that. All the other topic selections are either inconsequential or obvious pitfalls, so I didn't bother with them and instead moved on to gathering witnesses. Brother Nicodemus, Adela, Guta, and Pavel will all agree to testify without any issues upon talking to them. Meanwhile, there's no point to interacting with Sebastian von Berg, as mentioned earlier, and the same thing goes for Father Fabian, who is clearly part of the prosecution. The bailiff, on the other hand, seems to be mostly neutral to the issue, so when I was given the option to bribe him towards the end of the conversation, I refrained from doing so. We learn from him that Katra, the blacksmith's wife, is involved somehow, which turned out to be true. In the middle of their exchange, there is a charisma check that we must pass, because it will make her confess that the troublemakers we talked about earlier was her doing, an essential piece of info that we can use against her. Before we go to Johanka, we'll pay a visit to the guard wearing a white armor found just outside of her sleeping quarters and steal his retinue papers. This will allow us to talk to her upon presenting it to the sentry on duty.
Here's a document. See?
Show me that. That's fine. Thank you, sir.
In the following conversation, we know that she will be quite stubborn about her stance, and none of our persuasive powers will work. The only one who can change her mind is Matthias, but he is currently in a catatonic state, so we should report back to Brother Nicodemus first, which would trigger his awakening afterwards. Retrieve his lucky dice and hand it over to Johanka, and we should now be ready.
Look, Matthias gave me this for you, and he asked me to tell you to look out for yourself.
Thank you, Henry. Go now. I need to rest.
But before we talk to the bishop and initiate the trial, it's a good idea to maximize our speech and charisma capabilities first. So we should chug down on the potions we talked about earlier and get him to drink an alcoholic beverage. Even though the event technically happens the next day, I know the buffs will be carried over, as evidenced by our stats visible during dialogue checks, and Henry, who's clearly intoxicated as he defends Johanka. If you accomplish everything mentioned in this guide, the entire procedure will be amusing to watch as we thoroughly counter everything the prosecution throws at us. Some of the key highlights include dismantling all arguments posited by Father Fabian, and thanks to Henry's investigations, Katra's statements have been nullified by the Inquisitor. Even Sebastian von Berg will get his comeuppance as he gets humiliated in front of the court. You have to see it for yourself, it's very entertaining. So there we have it, our guide on how to get Madonna of Sasau's good ending. If you have any question or would like some clarifications, the comment section is always open.